This program was made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency that supports research, education, and humanities programs for the general public, and by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Funding for this program was also provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
In late 1918, a young British naval officer was off the coast of Africa when word reached him that the war was over. News of the Allied victory brought Harold Owen a curious sense of sadness.
It bothered me that I could not, to myself, account for my restless unease. I felt horribly flat. I stared out over the incredibly blue expanse of glittering sea. And perhaps something in the limitless stretch of water and sky affected me. I realized with a surge of happiness that the war had not broken my own family. My brother Wilfred must be all right now. He was safe, and so was I.
But soon after, as Owen walked to his cabin, he had a premonition about his brother, who had been fighting in France.
I had gone down to my cabin to write some letters. I drew aside the door curtain and stepped inside. I felt shock run through me with appalling force. To my amazement, I saw Wilfred sitting in my chair. I spoke quietly. "Wilfred, how did you get here?" He did not rise, and I saw he was immobile, but his eyes were alive with the familiar look of trying to make me understand. I must have turned my eyes away from him. When I looked back, my cabin chair was empty. I felt an overpowering sense of absolute loss. I knew with certainty that Wilfred was dead. Why did he have to die?
More than a month later, Owen received a letter confirming what he already knew. His brother Wilfred was dead. He had been killed in action in the last week of the war. Harold would be haunted by the question, why, from that day on. The search for an answer would cast a shadow over his life and the lives of an entire generation of survivors. For them, the Great War would be a war without end.
The stage is set. The destiny disclosed. It has come about by no plan of our conceiving, but by the hand of God, who led us into this way. We cannot turn back. The light streams upon the path ahead and nowhere else.
Woodrow Wilson had an answer to the question of why so many had died. For him, the Great War was the war to end all wars. His vision of global democracy had met with thunderous applause when he arrived at the Paris Peace Conference at the end of the war. But by the time he left Europe in 1919, most of the cheering crowds were gone. His dreams, too, had been whittled down to their barest essential. A League of Nations to ensure world peace. The League, Wilson declared, was the only way to justify the carnage of the war.
If the League of Nations should ever be impaired, I would get the boys who went across the water to fight, and I would say, "Boys, I told you before you went across the seas that this was a war against wars. But I'm obliged to come to you in mortification and shame and say, you are betrayed. You fought for something that you did not get."
Wilson had decided to risk his political life on the League of Nations. But he lacked enough votes in Congress to pass the treaty. Rather than compromise with his political opponents, he told his wife Edith he would bypass Congress and make an appeal directly to the American public.
Towards the end of August, he said that as a last resort, he must go to the country to explain to the people what failure to ratify would mean. This proposed trip was stoutly opposed by Dr. Grayson, his physician, who did not think the president could draw further on his strength without risking disaster.
Along with his political strength, Wilson's health was failing. He fumbled with note cards when making speeches. His memory was no longer sharp. And now, he faced a grueling coast-to-coast train tour. But his life mattered little, he told his wife, compared to the treaty.
To my dying day, I shall esteem it the crowning privilege of my life to have been permitted to put my name to a document like this. I want to say that this is an unparalleled achievement of thoughtful civilization. The heart of humanity beats in this document. It is a liberation of the peoples and of the human forces of the world.
The cities and states came and went. Wilson began to have headaches so severe that he could barely speak. 23 days into the presidential tour, his train pulled out of Pueblo, Colorado. Neither Wilson nor his wife knew it, but he had just made his last public speech.
I found him sitting on the side of his bed. He said he had tried to sleep, but the pain had grown unbearable.
In the fight of his political life, Wilson was felled by a stroke.
Nothing the doctor could do gave relief. The dear face opposite me was drawn and lined. As I sat there watching the dawn break slowly, I felt that life would never be the same. We left for Washington. That night was the longest and most heartbreaking of my life.
He's stricken with what appears to be, in medical terms, a transient ischemic attack in Colorado, returns to the White House and has a much larger stroke, apparently, some days after his return, leaves him partially paralyzed, thick of speech, unable to appear in public for many, many months. And it's in that condition that he has to somehow or other muster his troops for the final battle in the Senate on behalf of the treaty.
The White House was reorganized as a hospital. Months passed before Wilson was well enough to carry out his duties. But he made one message clear. He would accept no amendments to his cherished treaty.
His grasp on reality was probably not as sure as it would have been under other circumstances. And his medical condition, no doubt, reinforced a kind of self-righteous and rigid characteristic in his personality that rendered him even more incapable than he might otherwise have been of compromise. And he would not compromise.
The treaty was voted down. The defeat left Wilson's vision of world peace as broken as the president. Wilson served out the rest of his term an invalid. He died in 1924, as much a casualty of the war as any soldier who fell on the battlefield.
Another little drink, another little drink, another little drink wouldn't do us any harm. Another little drink, another little drink, another little.
We drank farewell to civilization with an air of finality, while Wilmot performed on an upright piano.
Wouldn't do us any harm. Another little drink, another little drink, another little drink.
We all became confidential and almost emotional.
Another little drink, another little drink wouldn't do us any harm. Another little drink, another little drink.
At such a moment as that, the war felt quite a friendly affair.
Another little drink, another little drink, another little drink wouldn't do us any harm. Another little drink.
As horrible as the war was, it was an experience that many people found positive, productive, and worthwhile. They came out very attached to their experience of the war, thinking that this was the best time of their lives, that they had experienced comradeship with other men that they had never even thought possible before. And for many of these men, the road back was just very, very difficult.
The road back was especially difficult for the British poet Siegfried Sassoon. Throughout his life, he would try to write of other things, but he always found himself returning to the war.
The man who endured the war at its worst was everlastingly differentiated from everyone, except his fellow soldiers.
Many rarely spoke of what they had seen. But the maimed had no way of disguising their scars of war. An army of the walking wounded returned home to societies ill-equipped to deal with the traumas of war. An American military film tried to show how even amputees might still enjoy a game of baseball.
Does it matter, losing your legs? For people will always be kind. And you need not show that you mind when the others come in after hunting to gobble their muffin and eggs. Does it matter, losing your sight? There's such splendid work for the blind. And the people will always be kind as you sit on the terrace remembering and turning your face to the light. Do they matter, those dreams from the pit? You can drink and forget and be glad. And people won't say that you're mad, for they'll know that you fought for your country, and no one will worry a bit.
Among the most tragic victims of the war were what the French called the men with broken faces. One who helped these men cope with their injuries was the British orderly Ward Muir.
Hideous is the only word for these smashed faces. The skewed mouth, and worse, far the worst, the incredibly brutalizing effects which are the consequences of wounds in the nose. To talk to a lad who 6 months ago was probably a wholesome and pleasing specimen of English youth, and is now a gargoyle, is an ordeal.
These were the soldiers who continued to show what suffering in the trenches had meant. They were a continuous reminder of what they had gone through in the gas attack, in the bombardment, in being buried for hours under the earth and being at the brink of psychological collapse. And many of the population did not like to have to face these war cripples. They did not wish to be remembered continuously of what war was really like. And these bodies were really sites of remembrance.
When medical science failed to help these mutilated men, artisans took over. The skills of the sculptor were called upon in special clinics. Using pre-war photos of the patients, sculptors fashioned thin masks to cover the worst wounds.
It is difficult to convey a fair impression of the extraordinary sort of precision with which these membrane-like but strong metal masks adhere to the face and cover the grisly gap beneath them. Figure what this means to the patient. Instead of being a gargoyle ashamed to show himself on the streets, he is almost a normal human being and can go anywhere unafraid. Self-respect returns to him, his depression departs.
Concealing war wounds was one way of coping with a war that refused to go away. Bringing attention to them was another. The German artist, Otto Dix, knew what disfigurement did to a man. He had been a soldier during the war and was now suffering from nightmares.
I'm obsessed with the devil. That is how I know what's up in the world.
He painted, he said, to rid himself of the demons of war.
after the war, he's actually painting the effects of the war on human bodies. Really, the psychological effect as well, and the mental devastation on the human being, but he images it in the flesh in this really crude, deliberately grotesque manner, because he really wants to shock people. The effects of war are when you see somebody with half their face scoured away walking down the street and you try and look away.
The people were already beginning to forget what unspeakable suffering the war had brought with it. It's not the task of artists to correct and convert. They are much too small for that. But they must give their testimony.
Dix painted what he saw around him. Former soldiers reduced to selling matches on the street. Disfigured amputees with horrid head and facial wounds. And women who chose prostitution over starvation.
Once the war is over, the prostitute and the war cripple are the two most trenchant ways in which you could actually image on a human body the horrors and the degradation of the war. So he implies that the brutalizing done to you, whether as a soldier or as a prostitute in that war, was savage and real.
Dix's paintings also document growing feelings of anti-Semitism. In this painting, a German amputee rolls over a pamphlet announcing Juden raus, Jews out. It was another disfigurement plaguing Germany after the war. As time passed, the battlefields of the Great War became hallowed ground. They were sites of pilgrimage. Thousands tried to retrace the footsteps of their loved ones. Was there an answer here for the question why so many had died? Those that came soon after the war found the landscape still an open wound, the trenches still littered with human remains. One who wandered across these fields of desolation in 1920 was the British journalist Stephen Graham.
The stagnancy has not dried up, but festers still in the black rot below the rushes. Double shell holes, charred ground, great pits. What is it now? The abode of rats, lizards, weasels, unexploded stick bombs, rusty grog bottles. Helmets lie there still in plenty. There are broken rifles. There are graves. Death and the ruins completely outweigh the living. There is a pull from the other world.
What, Graham asked, had it all meant? The enormity of the destruction and death. Like a modern Hamlet, he found the answers elusive.
Lying in an old trench, behold, a skull. It is clean and polished, a soldier's head. There is a frayed hole in an otherwise perfect cranium. The simplest way to pick it up would be to put a finger in the eye hole and lift it. Friend or foe. The more you look at the skull, the more angry does it seem. It has an intense, eternal grievance. This one does not grin, for the mouth has been destroyed. It is just blind and senseless, forever and ever.
By 1922, the battlefields were cleared and national cemeteries for the dead of the Great War were created. But the pull from the other world still held millions of survivors in its grip. One was Katie Kollwitz, one of the great artists of her time. In the first days of the war, she had watched her 19-year-old son, Peter, march off to fight. He was killed on his second day in battle.
I knew it all even then. I sat on the bed and wept, wept, wept. Where do all these women find the courage to send their dear ones to the front to face the guns, when they have watched over them all their lives with loving care?
Kollwitz's art had always portrayed the hardships of the anguished. With the death of her son, she joined them. She tried to express her grief by creating a monument to her dead son. But her guilt made the task so painful that she put it aside, for years at a time.
Is it a break of faith with you, Peter, if I can only see madness in this war? But I shall do this work for you and for the others. Dear Peter, I ask you then to be around me. Help me. Show yourself to me.
The real impetus comes when she visits the graveyard in Belgium, where her son's remains were placed in 1926. And she goes away and she decides the only thing she can do for this sea of crosses is two figures of her husband and herself. And she chooses this mourning, grieving father and the grieving mother, who she places in the center of this graveyard so that they encompass, they grieve for every young man who lay in that field. And when she goes to install it in 1932, she describes in a letter home how she goes to look at it, then she goes to her son's grave, and then she walks back to her own image and she weeps. And she strokes the cheeks of the figure she's carved to look like herself with her own tears. And it seems to me that that reconciliation, that redemption, is what that statue's about.
My husband stood close behind me. I heard him whisper, yes. How close we were to one another then.
Katie Kolwitz could visit her son's grave. But what of the millions less fortunate? Those who could not afford to make the journey? Or those whose sons had vanished without a trace? In Britain, the government's solution was the unveiling of a memorial in the heart of London, an empty tomb called the Cenotaph. It commemorated the nearly 1 million dead of the British Empire. But for some, this gesture was not enough. They sought relief in a growing movement called spiritualism.
In the presence of an agonized world, hearing every day of the deaths of the flower of our race and the first promise of their unfulfilled youth, seeing around one the wives and mothers who had no clear conception where their loved ones had gone, I seemed suddenly to see that it was really something tremendous, a breaking down of the walls between two worlds, a direct, undeniable message from beyond, a call of hope and of guidance to the human race at the time of its deepest affliction.
Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, was one of the leaders of spiritualism. He had lost several loved ones in the war, including his son, Kingsley. Like others, Conan Doyle found hope in the possibility of communication with the dead. Conan Doyle believed that this blurred image floating above his head was that of his son. In the wake of the Great War, millions were caught up in the spiritualist resurgence.
Spiritualism gave people a chance to have a ritual interment of members of their family whose graves were not known or who had literally been blown to pieces. Maybe half of the men who were killed in the First World War had no known graves. The families had no place to go through the rituals of separation. A seance was one of them.
Six of us, all personal friends, sat in a semicircle. My wife being on my left. Presently, a voice came quite close to my face. Both my wife and I cried out that it was our boy. He began to talk. He tried to console me for his death. I asked, "Are you happy?" He answered, "I am happy now." He put his strong, heavy hand on my head and pressed as solidly as possible. And I can assure you that he left me a good deal happier than he found me.
Communicating with the dead was the way Conan Doyle dealt with his pain. He gave up writing Sherlock Holmes stories altogether, but he never escaped the shadow of loss. Spiritualism was one way of coping with the war. The new medium of motion pictures was another. And in its own way, the cinema was also able to raise the dead. Most portrayals of the war were pure spectacle, but powerful statements were also made. One of the first was a French film, J'accuse, I Accuse. The director was Abel Gance. Because of bad health, he was turned down for military service, while many of his friends died on the battlefield. He decided to express his anger by making a film even as the war was still being fought. Remarkably, Gance had the help of the French army.
What he did to get French army cooperation was to make it appear to be a justification of war, extremely patriotic, in fact chauvinistic, so that he had tremendous war backing. And then one day he was doing the opening titles with thousands of French soldiers forming the title J'accuse, and a French general said, by the way, what are you accusing? And he said, I'm accusing the war, I'm accusing man, I'm accusing universal stupidity.
The film's hero, like Gance himself, was horrified by the war. While standing in a cemetery, he witnesses the dead rise from their graves. Not to comfort the living, but to pass judgment on them.
And the corpses come to life and march through the country streets into the villages to ask, has our death been worthwhile? And the hero runs terrified ahead of them, warning the inhabitants, grabbing them and saying, for God's sake, what have you been doing since your husband died? You know, how many men have you been living with? You're going to meet your husband any minute. And it was so powerful that in some places, certainly in England, women fainted and had to be taken out of the cinema.
These ghosts were not actors. They were actual soldiers on furlough. Gance called his cast the dead on leave. After filming the movie, many of these men died in battle. These haunting images are the last visual memories of them. J'accuse stands to this day as a powerful statement about war. But in Germany, the idea of accusation would be put to an entirely different purpose. The march home from the war was a lingering, bitter memory for German soldiers. They had come back as an army, defeated but unbowed. Many believed they had been betrayed at home, stabbed in the back. In the last days of the war, a young corporal was recovering in a hospital. Adolf Hitler had been gassed and was temporarily blinded. It was then that a local pastor broke the news of the armistice.
When the old gentleman began to tell us that we were throwing ourselves at the mercy of the victors, I could stand it no longer. I tottered and groped my way back to the dormitory, threw myself on my bunk and dug my burning head into my blanket and pillow. And so it had all been in vain. In vain, all the sacrifices and privations. In vain, the hunger and thirst of months which were often endless. In vain, the deaths of 2 million who died. Was this the meaning of the sacrifice which the German mother made to the fatherland when with sore heart she let her best-loved boys march off, never to see them again? Hatred grew in me. Hatred for those responsible for this deed. In the days that followed, my own fate became known to me. I decided to go into politics.
The last days of the war were the first days of Adolf Hitler's crusade.
The war is a turning point, and as he sits there in 1918, eyes swathed in bandages, hearing that Germany has lost the war, he is absolutely mesmerized and appalled and dumbstruck that this could have happened. And really his political career thereafter is in some ways, it begins almost immediately, an attempt to find those responsible, the November criminals, for the stab in the back.
Would not the graves of all the hundreds of thousands open? The graves of those who with faith in the fatherland had marched forth, never to return? Would they not open and send the silent mud and blood-covered heroes back as spirits of vengeance to the homeland which had cheated them with such mockery?
It's absolutely impossible to understand Hitler without the First World War. He was a creature of the war. He embodies so many characteristics of the generation of 1914. He was driven by the same sort of nostalgia for the experience of the trenches, for the comradeship of the trenches.
Hitler reveled in the memory of the Great War. His first political allies were fellow veterans. Among them, the former commander of Germany's army, Erich Ludendorff. What these old soldiers shared was the conviction that it was not the army that had lost the war, but Germans at home. Hitler provided the scapegoat. Jewish radicals who had sparked revolution during and after the war.
If, at the beginning and during the war, someone had only subjected about 12 or 15,000 of those Hebrew destroyers of the people to poison gas, as was suffered on the battlefield by hundreds of thousands of our best workers from all social classes and all walks of life, then the sacrifice of millions at the front would not have been in vain.
Hitler came to power in 1933. He quickly began imprisoning communists and Jews and treated them like enemies on the battlefield.
Hitler could not have done what he did without the First World War. It isn't the Second World War that created images of piles of bodies being shoveled into trenches. It's the First World War. So as it were, what was thinkable, what was imaginable about human brutality changed between 1914 and 1918. And without that shifting of perspective, in my view, the worst events of the Second World War would not have been possible.
The clear red blood of Germany had to flow, declared one Nazi, until the country was purified. Industrial slaughter, born in one World War, took on an even more terrible form in the Second. In the midst of the Second World War, as the Allies bombed Berlin, the artist Katie Kollwitz fled the city.
It is incomprehensible to me what degrees of endurance people can manifest. In days to come, people will hardly understand this age.
If the First World War began blurring the distinction between military and civilian targets, the Second World War erased it. For both sides, the bombing of cities became commonplace.
What a difference between now and 1914. People have been transformed so that they have this capacity for endurance. Worst of all is that every war already carries within the war that will answer it. Every war is answered by a new war until everything is smashed.
Six days before her death in 1945, Katie Kollwitz wrote her last letter. War, she declared, accompanies me to the end. The same could be said for the generation of Great War survivors. Others we have met in this series, like the Australian Cyril Lawrence, put on a uniform again in World War II. So did the Frenchman Henri Desaignan. The survivor of Verdun lived to see the liberation of France. Otto Dix was drafted into the German Civil Guard. He was captured by the French and survived the war. Harry Truman, who had fired off one of the last shots of the First World War, also gave the command to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, ending the Second. Vera Brittain became a pacifist. She took the unpopular stand of opposing strategic bombing in the Second World War. The former Kaiser Wilhelm II died in the midst of World War II. He spent the last days of his life chopping wood with his one good arm. Siegfried Sassoon continued to revisit the trenches of the Great War in his poetry and prose. He died in 1967, still a soldier in his mind and his memories. He couldn't forget, but feared the rest of us would.
Have you forgotten yet? For the world's events have rumbled on since those gagged days, like traffic checked while at the crossing of city ways. But the past is just the same, and war's a bloody game. Have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war that you'll never forget. Do you remember the dark months you held the sector at Mametz? The nights you watched and wired and dug and piled sandbags on parapets? Do you remember the rats? And the stench of corpses rotting in front of the frontline trench? And dawn coming, dirty white, and chill with a hopeless rain. Do you ever stop and ask, is it all going to happen again? Do you remember that hour of din before the attack? And the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook you as you peered at the doomed and haggard faces of your men. Do you remember the stretcher cases lurching back, with dying eyes and lolling heads? Those ashen grey masks of the lads who once were keen and kind and gay. Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget.
This program was made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency that supports research, education, and humanities programs for the general public, and by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Funding for this program was also provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
To order a video cassette of this program or the complete 8-part series of The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, call PBS Video at 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
This personal equipment of the soldier is his absolute last line of defense. From the World War I doughboy, poorly equipped for the slaughter of no man's land, to the soldier of the future, navigating across the battlefield like a vision from a science fiction film. Trace the remarkable evolution of this vital battle gear. Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war.
Even on today's sophisticated electronic battlefield, there inevitably comes a time when the individual soldier must face the deadly fire of his enemy. The equipment he carries into battle, his body armor and personal weapons, are his key to survival. On today's battlefield, a skillful use of strategic weapons may make the difference between victory and defeat. But for the soldier, his individual battle gear may make the difference between life and death. This is the soldier of the future. The battle gear he is wearing is called SIPE, the Soldier Integrated Protective Ensemble. By interfacing man with machine, this experimental battle gear offers many new ways for the individual soldier to become more lethal. From protection against the elements to heightened sensory awareness, the capabilities of this combatant are described in words typically reserved for tanks and helicopters. This soldier packs remarkable mobility, protection, and firepower.
The next generation of combat gear will enhance the individual warrior. What it will do will make each soldier more capable, more lethal, and more survivable. And as that combat capability increases through the use of this technology, you will see one man in the future capable of doing what maybe a platoon or a company of infantrymen can do today.
Unlike battle gear of the past that was regarded as separate, unrelated elements, SIPE is an integrated modular head-to-toe fighting system. At the heart of the system is the SIPE helmet. It is fitted with a night vision image intensifier as well as a remote viewing system. By just pointing his weapon, the soldier receives thermal images on his visor's heads-up display. He can see around corners and through all battlefield conditions, smoke or fog, day or night. He can scan the battlefield to acquire or engage targets without exposing himself to enemy threats. For long-range listening, sensitive unidirectional microphones are mounted on his rifle. Again, by just pointing his weapon, he can detect personnel at 300 meters and vehicles at 1,000 meters. The SIPE soldier carries a powerful backpack-mounted computer, which includes a satellite global positioning system. He can, in seconds, determine his battlefield position to within 100 feet. Through his visor display, he can also view maps, check a digital compass, and even reference a data bank of information from first aid to enemy vehicle and weapon recognition.
The improved technology that we will see in the next few years will have a great effect on command and control of land forces. It will allow him, through this digital system, to receive orders, to pass reports, and to get a greater sense of situational awareness on the battlefield.
These warriors will be able to communicate soldier to soldier, and through a small video camera will be able to gather real-time battlefield intelligence and transmit it back to their commanders. In addition to its remarkable electronic features, SIPE also incorporates an array of protective elements against flame, chemical and biological agents, lasers, and extreme climate conditions. It also includes articulated body armor for ballistic protection. Developed by the U.S. Army Natick Research, Development, and Engineering Center in Massachusetts, the SIPE system is still just an experiment. Engineers continue to refine the technology as well as study the psychological factors.
What we're asking now is that if we develop this technology, is that the soldier will actually be masked from the real world, and he will be fighting the world inside his visor. And it will take some training and some adaptation of the individual soldier to get used to that, because it is a very, very human reaction to not want to fight with a mask on. So there's some interesting human dimensions to this that will have to be overcome. What we see with the SIPE technology is the beginning of the enhanced warrior technological revolution. It is awkward now, and it is difficult to maintain, and it will take a while before that technology is proven. But it will be proven, and it will be miniaturized, and at some point it will become standard fare of soldiers around the world.
The SIPE system is a remarkable feat of human engineering, the culmination of efforts that began almost a century ago. Prior to World War I, armies made the first attempts at human engineering to outfit soldiers with battle gear that allowed them to move efficiently and safely across the battlefield. Tests determined the load a soldier carries should not exceed 1/3 his body weight. The iron and leather battle gear of the past was replaced with lighter and more comfortable canvas web gear. Bright colors of the 19th century battlefield were replaced with khaki, olive drab, and field gray. Even experiments with new camouflage uniforms were carried out in the field. But in spite of these efforts, the soldiers of World War I experienced the grave deficiencies of the battle gear of their era.
Many of the uniforms in the First World War, particularly on the Allied side, the British and American uniforms, were really unsuited for the kind of close physical combat that was common in the First World War. They were very hot with their high lace-up collars. It was difficult very often for the troops to get enough ventilation to prevent heat exhaustion. Many of the uniforms were tailored to look fairly smart on the parade ground so that they were not baggy enough and loose enough to give full freedom of movement on the battlefield itself.
The American uniform was fashioned from heavy wool and was worn all year round. The clothing was uncomfortable and the quality control was poor.
The entrepreneurs in America grabbed onto the Army contracts, and they made millions on some of the lousiest made clothing that you ever saw. And no fitting. He didn't throw you out and says, here, try this on. He threw it at you, and that was yours. And we went around among the troop trading with each other. Let me try yours and try mine, see if it would fit you better. So I traded practically with somebody else for almost everything I had I got my shoes. My shoes luckily fit me.
The doughboys were issued just one uniform. It was to be used on parade, for training, and in combat as well.
All of us practically asked, well, what do we do our training and work in? He says that, you know, right there. So in other words, we ask, we do everything in this uniform? Yes, sir. What if we go into a firefight? You wear the same uniform. What if we have to lay and crawl in the mud? Same uniform. It was ridiculous.
Battle Gear will continue in a moment here on A&E here.
Since the dawn of warfare, man has sought to protect himself from the weapons of his enemies.
As armies developed better skills, they developed more metal armor. And of course, in the Middle Ages, you see the epitome of metal armor in the armored knight. What's happened in the 20th century is that mobility is very important, and you cannot have an armored knight running around on the battlefield. He's too slow. He's a big target. But the helmet's important to protect him from artillery projectiles and from grenade fragments and all the fragments that are flying around on the battlefield.
When World War I first started, the development of the ballistic metal helmet was actually something that was not seen as important. Many armies went into battle with soft caps, and it wasn't until the first great battles of World War I that the commanding officers understood that many men were being injured from shell fragments, from overhead artillery bursts, and that better protection for the head would actually prevent a great many casualties.
If the bullets are on the trajectory where it was possible, they would skip, hit it, and knock your head off to the side and go on sway. And everybody's helmet had dents from ricochets.
The Allied Army's pie-tin-style helmets were designed to protect against artillery barrages from above, but they offered little protection for the side and back of the neck.
The helmet was too shallow, and I had a man killed right next to me where he was hit in the back of the head. I don't know whether it was a bullet or shrapnel, but he was killed instantly.
The German army began the war wearing a polished leather helmet with a spike on top. The spike was only decorative and served no functional purpose. In 1916, they introduced an excellent steel helmet.
The German helmet was so beautifully designed. It covered the back of your neck, your ears. It was heavy. It's the only bad thing about it, very heavy. But once you slip that thing down over your head, you felt very secure. And I could have imagined that going across no man's land with that, it was far superior. We wish we had them.
Before the armies of World War I adopted steel helmets, 1 in 4 head wounds proved fatal. Afterwards, the fatalities decreased to only 1 in 7. World War I saw the introduction of technologically advanced new weapons. The airplane, the tank, the machine gun. But the soldier in the trenches still relied on the simple, proven technology of the bolt-action rifle. The mainstay of the American Army was the 1903 Springfield rifle. This reliable weapon was accurate to over 600 meters.
The Springfield 30-06 was an excellent firearm, well tested, very good, very accurate. But now here's one fault The Springfield with the bayonet attached was about a foot shorter than the German rifle. They could stand off and stick you to pieces if all you had was a Springfield. Your Springfield would be about that far from hitting him, straight out like that. So we were given lots of instruction by the French instructor on how to overcome the shortness of our rifle. We had to learn to be experts in fending off, so we got to be pretty good with maneuvering and slapping and using a rifle and a bayonet. That was the only way we could survive.
The German rifle was the Mauser 98. It too was accurate to over 600 meters.
The Mauser was at the time the most popular military bolt-action rifle in the world. It had been built for armies all over the world. The Mauser Action was probably the best single military bolt-action rifle ever constructed. The Springfield rifle, in fact, was built to a Mauser license, and the Germans, Japanese, and Americans all used Mauser pattern rifles.
Another simple but invaluable part of World War I battle gear was a very old weapon, the hand grenade.
The term grenadier from the 1700s comes from a soldier who was given a bomb with a fuse to light and throw on the battlefield. Now, the problem with these grenadiers was that the bomb was usually a little unreliable. So more grenadiers were blown up before they could throw their grenades, in many cases, than after the grenade landed. So grenadiers and the use of grenades kind of left the battlefield in the late 1800s and didn't really reoccur until you got into the trench fighting of World War I.
The Americans used the so-called pineapple grenade. The casing of this grenade was designed to explode into fragments. Battle-seasoned French and British soldiers taught the doughboys proper technique for tossing grenades, but the throwing action came naturally to the Americans.
That was one of my favorite weapons. I love grenades because I was a baseball pitcher. And in high school, I was the #1 pitcher on the high school team. And so I had very strong throwing arm. And you know, you don't throw a grenade like that. And there are no curves or underhands. You lob grenade with the entire shoulder and hand. And I got to be real good with a grenade. When they wanted somebody to dump a grenade in the trench, call Roche, get him down there. I'd get down and dump a couple of grenades to be sure it was empty. Nobody. So I love their grenades. I always had one, something hung over my belt.
The close combat of World War I was brutal, and consequently some brutal weapons were devised as part of the soldiers' battle gear.
This is the French trench knife, a deadly instrument. You look at something like this and think about that going into your gut or being hit in the face. Even a straight blow, like a right hook, would knock you out, tear your face up, mutilate you. And you stop to think of this, a human being using this on another human being. It's unbelievable.
Between the wars, America paid little attention to the lessons of World War I. The U.S. Army was ill-prepared for another conflict.
Up until the late 30s, the American combat soldier would have gone to war looking very much like the World War I trooper. Then, based on early results from the war in Europe, the Quartermaster Corps began developing new combat uniforms. We came to the realization that it was more efficient, if somewhat more costly in material, to have a dress uniform that was suitable for parade use, and also to have specific combat uniforms designed not to look smart, but to give better protection against the weather, greater freedom of movement, in some cases to be adaptable to different types of climate.
The new combat uniforms were tailored for a looser fit. The web gear was lighter and less restrictive. And finally, the ineffective flat helmet was scrapped and replaced with a new two-piece design.
The M1 helmet shell itself was formed from Hadfield sheet steel, and then an internal helmet liner was fitted that contained all of the webbing to fit the helmet to the soldier's head, and also carried one pair of straps. The second pair of straps was attached directly to the metal shell. On parade and in maneuvers, the helmets were often strapped under the chin. In combat, this was not considered appropriate because heavy concussion from nearby shell hits could, in fact, rip the helmet off the head, breaking the soldier's neck, or even, in some severe cases, almost decapitating it.
It was very good equipment. It was fairly lightweight and very effective. We had combat boots, which came up about halfway up your calf of your leg, and they were rough, untreated leather on the outside. They had a heavy composition sole about between 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch thick, and they had a smooth leather top. And you put some kind of wax on them that's supposed to keep them fairly waterproof. That was a good boot for the summertime, it was a good boot for the wintertime, up to a certain point. But they were not effective at all in the real cold weather. In fact, we got in the Battle of the Bulge. They just wasn't worth a damn. And these poor infantry soldiers standing in these foxholes all the time, their feet would get wet, and they never got dry. And so that's fine to do it for a couple of days, but after 2 weeks of that sort of thing, your feet begin to swell, and they swell against that rough leather, and they can't swell anymore because there's no room in your boot. And the foot swells so much it cuts off the circulation, you develop gangrene, and that's what you call trench foot. And your feet turn absolutely black, and we had a number of men that lost both feet, or one foot, or parts of their feet. They never recovered from it. Later on, about the last 2 weeks of the Battle of the Bulge, they said, man, we got a good deal for you. So they brought it to shoe packs. And the shoe packs were a great big rubber boot that went about halfway up to your ankles. Then on top of that, it had an impregnated canvas that went above that. It was laced up all the way. And the bottom of the shoe pack had a solid felt sole 1 inch thick. And you put 2 pair of socks on it 1 inch thick, and you can stand in sub-zero weather, freezing up to your rear end, and you can't feel it. They were terrific.
The development of German combat gear between the wars was largely an evolution of the World War I gear. Essentially, the German soldier in 1938 or 1939 was equipped with combat gear remarkably similar to what the German soldier had carried from 1916 to 1918.
Although based on the old design, the German battle gear was considered some of the finest of the war. However, it was heavier than other armies' equipment.
Altogether, that weighed about 60 pounds. Just the personal equipment, not counting the ammunition and the rifle. And in addition, each one had to carry 1 box with 300 rounds of ammunition for the light machine gun. So by the time we went on hiking, we had about 90 pounds to carry. And we were trained at the age of 17, walking 10 miles a day. Then next week we went up to 20 and so on until we reached about 40 miles a day with that equipment.
The German steel helmet of the Great War continued to serve the Army well in World War II.
They worked pretty good.
I got a shot underneath the rim of the steel helmet. The steel helmet had a turned down sort of a rim. Yeah, it's turned down. And the bullet went around it, and out on the front side. You could see it was ripped open all around. But they were pretty good, but a little heavy.
After World War I, the U.S. Army experimented with automatic rifles. These early tests led to the development of the M1 Garand.
The M1 Garand rifle was developed in the mid-1930s. It was adopted in 1936. It is generally considered to have been one of the finest semi-automatic rifles ever built. It was incredibly accurate for a semi-automatic rifle. The standard issue Garand rifle was quite capable of killing a man at over 500 yards. When issued for sniper use with a scope, it was considered standard to go for headshots at 400 yards.
For added firepower, the M1 Garand was also fitted with a grenade launcher attachment. Like their uniforms, the German rifles were also just refined versions of their World War I models.
The standard infantry weapon for the German soldier in World War II was the Mauser Model 98K infantry rifle. This is a slightly shortened version of the Mauser 98 that was used in World War I. It held 5 rounds in a permanent well magazine below the bolt. It was fed from the top with 5-shot stripper clips. It was a very accurate weapon, easy to use, well balanced, not very heavy.
Very, very accurate rifle. You just have to be calm and use it properly. If people are nervous and don't aim correctly, then of course the bullet goes anywhere. But I always preferred the bolt action because it forces you to aim after every shot instead of just pulling a trigger and not looking where the bullets go.
The U.S. forces supplemented their pineapple fragmentation grenades with incendiary grenades, smoke grenades, and phosphorus grenades. The Germans carried powerful grenades with wooden handles that the Americans nicknamed potato mashers.
We had a very bulky hand grenade, exactly the same as they had in World War I. It consisted of a soup can size explosive device on top, and then I would say about 9 to 12-inch long wooden handle. And on the end of the wooden handle, you had this little ring to pull it, and then you could use this and throw it. Due to the fact that this was a whipping action, you could throw it pretty far. But it was extremely bulky, and we didn't like it at all.
During the war, soldiers faced extreme weather conditions. Often, only their resourcefulness and creativity allowed them to survive. The Germans were equipped with excellent battle gear, and their uniforms looked sharp. But they were ill prepared for the intense cold of the Russian front.
Soldier is supposed to be proud of a good appearance he's supposed to make in public. Whether this is useful, functional, the best for the function in a area, in a situation like I was in, this is a different question. The Russian had an ugly-looking uniform, but it was warm. And ours looked pretty, it was cold, it was much too thin. So they had no problem surviving these 80 and 90 below zero wind chill factors in comparison with us, where we froze to death.
Battle Gear will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Bullet-resistant body armor was developed for use in World War II. Flak suits proved too heavy and cumbersome for the infantry, but the Air Corps adopted them for their bomber crews.
Since crews of aircraft did not have to undergo the same kind of physical exertion, such as carrying great weights over long distances, they would be able to use body armor.
Analysis of wounds inflicted on air crews revealed 70% were due to missiles of relatively low velocity, the kind that could be stopped by a flak suit.
The armored suits developed for the Air Force in World War II were largely successful in defending against both 88mm flak shrapnel coming in from outside the airplane, and occasionally from shells that exploded in the aircraft, and 20mm cannon shell fragments from enemy fighters.
The flak suits were built from manganese steel strips contained in canvas pockets on the vests. The helmets also contained overlapping steel strips. The flak suits were unwieldy, weighing over 17 pounds, but they were designed with a ripcord for quick removal if the bomber crews needed to bail out.
Thousands of these sets of armored suits were in use by the Air Force by the early part of 1944. There were numerous cases of aircrew being hit in the head, in the torso, in the abdomen, and suffering only superficial wounds or sometimes no penetrating wound whatsoever when unprotected.